Rumi said, "Silence is the language of God. Everything else is a poor translation. But what if the silence of your heart is not divine? And what if it brings not peace, but affliction? What if that silence you carry within you is the muffled cry of a soul in danger?" Sometimes someone's presence can be louder than any scream, not because of the sound, but because of the damage. It's the kind of presence that enters without asking permission, takes over everything and gradually silences your essence. And the cruelest part, you don't even realize it. You just start to fall silent, so you don't lose. Smiling, to avoid conflict. Accepting the bare minimum, for fear of being alone. But listen to this carefully. Not all silence is sacred. Not all company is a blessing. And not all love is a cure. Perhaps you are standing next to someone right now, and yet he feels more alone than ever. Perhaps your heart is already tired of talking to you, but you ignore him because you're afraid of what you'll hear. Go away. This is bad for you. You are not loved here. These are phrases that the heart whispers in the dark. But the mind, addicted to insisting, does not listen. Have you ever noticed how some people drain your energy, even without saying a word? How does their presence alter your breathing, your sleep, your laughter, your radiance? This is no coincidence. It's your body speaking, revealing what your courage is still unwilling to face. The heart asks for silence. When you realize that the presence is dangerous, when you understand that staying there is to die slowly and silently. But have you been listening to this request? Or have you confused presence with protection, silence with peace, love with anesthesia? Perhaps what you're feeling right now isn't just confusion, but the beginning of an awakening, because every weary soul one day learns to listen to its own heart, and when that day arrives, nothing can silence what was born to be free. Perhaps right now, at this very second, your heart is trying to tell you something your mind has always silenced. And if this video has reached you, it's no coincidence. It's because there's something inside you that needs to be heard, with courage, with presence, with truth. So before continuing, take a deep breath, and write here in the comments, "I listen to my heart, even when it asks for silence." This is not just a phrase, it's a commitment to your soul. And if this beginning resonated with you, if any part truly touched you, leave a like. It shows you're here and ready to continue this journey. Subscribe to the channel, because this conversation doesn't end here. She is only the beginning of a silence that will, little by little, transform into freedom. Have you ever felt that someone's presence steals your peace, but even so, you insist on staying? You know something is wrong, but you can't leave. And it's not because you don't see what's happening. It's because it hurts too much to admit that sometimes what hurts is exactly what you wished for. You don't stay for love. It's driven by fear. Fear of getting even more lost. Fear of being alone with one's own thoughts. The fear of looking in the mirror and realizing that you gave so much, that you forgot yourself. And that's where the most dangerous pain lies. The pain that no one sees. The pain you learned to hide, even from yourself. The one you smother with smiles, with routine, with excuses. But that, deep down, never disappears. It's there when you lie down, and the pillow weighs more than your body. She is stuck in silence between a message that has been seen and one that hasn't been replied to. She is in the unspoken words, in the empty stares, in the physical presence, but emotional absence. It's a subtle pain, almost invisible, and for that very reason devastating, because nobody asks if you're okay. Finally, you smile, you respond, you move on. But inside, you're craving some air, for a place where your soul can exist without fear, where you don't need to dim your own light so as not to disturb others, where your silence is welcomed, not ignored. Have you ever stopped to think about why you continue to give, even when you receive nothing in return? Why do you insist on staying, even knowing that there is no more reciprocity there? Perhaps it's because, deep down, you believe that one day this person will realize how valuable you are. Perhaps it's because at some point in your life you were taught that love is sacrifice. Those who love endure, wait, and bear with it. But is that really true? Does true love require silence? Does loving someone necessarily have to be accompanied by pain? Or is it that, by calling this love, you are simply trying to justify your fear of facing the void? Because yes, Emptiness is frightening. It's dark, lonely, unpredictable. But what no one told you is that emptiness can be the beginning of everything. The pause between the end of the pain and the beginning of the healing. The space where you finally listen to yourself. Where the soul stops begging and begins to breathe. Rumi said, "Don't linger in places where you cease to be yourself, but most insist, not out of love, but out of attachment, for memories that no longer exist, for promises that were never kept, through versions of the other that only existed within their own hope." And this is the cruelest cycle of invisible pain. You cling to the image of who someone was, and ignore who that person has become. You hope the past will return, while the present is destroying you. And every time you stay silent to avoid abandonment, you are the one who abandons yourself. The heart knows. He can sense when the environment ceases to be safe. He squeezes, shrinks, screams silently. But how can you hear that cry? If you've learned to survive in the noise, that is why your heart asks for silence. It's not the silence that hurts, but the silence that reveals. The sacred pause that makes you realize where you got lost. The moment you realize that being next to someone isn't a guarantee of connection. Because loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of oneself, even when surrounded by voices. Perhaps you are experiencing this right now. Perhaps you're in a relationship where you can't be yourself, where you have to tread carefully, measure your words, and disguise your feelings. Perhaps you no longer even know what your own voice is, from being silent for so long. And worse, perhaps he has begun to believe that this is normal. But the truth is that the soul becomes ill in such environments. It begins to wilt slowly. First, the desire to dream disappears. Then, the sparkle in their eyes fades. And finally, all that remains is silence. That silence that brings no peace. Yes, be warned. And no matter how much you try to ignore it, there comes a point when you can't anymore. The soul begins to cry out for help. In his tired eyes, anxiety that appears out of nowhere. In the anguish that takes over the chest for no reason. Tired of explaining, justifying, insisting. This is where many fall apart, or they wake up. Can you feel it? Do you feel like you're at your limit? Is the price of staying where you are getting too high? Perhaps it's time to stop, not to give up, but to listen. Because when the soul falls silent, it's because the pain has already spoken too loudly. And when the heart asks for silence, it's because it's tired of begging. And if you felt this video spoke directly to you, write in the comments, "I refuse to silence my soul for those who do not listen to me." Because sometimes everything starts with a silent decision, a written sentence, a new space for listening. There are people who don't yell, don't hit, don't betray. They don't need to. Their absence is never noticeable with noise, but with what they silence within you. They are presences disguised as care, which slowly drain your soul. A touch that seems like affection, but carries control. A look that seems like love, but hides judgment. A conversation that should be comforting, but always ends with you apologizing for feeling. And the scariest thing is how slowly it happens. At first you even feel special. The attention, the intensity, the gestures that make you believe that, this time, maybe it will be different. But then comes the subtle discomfort, small doubts that you begin to have about yourself. You start questioning yourself before speaking. You start hiding what you think, you change who you are, just to avoid being misunderstood. And without realizing it, you begin to lose yourself in the presence of the other person. This is how some presences become dangerous, not through apparent violence, but through the invisible deconstruction of your identity. And your heart, it feels it. Before the mind rationalizes, before words try to justify, before you convince yourself that everything is all right, the heart already knows. And that's why it begins to ask for silence. A silence that is not escape, but protection. A silence that says, "Here, I cannot be." And yet, you stay. Why? Perhaps because you still believe the problem is you. Perhaps because you've been conditioned to accept little, to settle for crumbs, to be grateful for any affection, even if it comes full of pain. Perhaps because you were taught that to be loved, you have to endure. But that's not love. That's emotional survival. It's a constant state of alert, where you never relax, never surrender, never rest in the certainty that you are loved as you are. And living like that, even in silence, is exhausting. These people don't hurt you with harsh words. They hurt you with strategic absences, with compliments that seem kind but are poisonous, with punishing silences, with judgmental glances, with love that demands more than it offers. These are relationships sustained by imbalance. The more you give, the less you receive. The more you yield, the more you negate yourself, to the point where you no longer recognize yourself, to the point where your soul becomes an echo, repeating the desires of someone who never truly listened to you. And even if you try to explain this pain to someone outside the family, it's difficult, because there are no visible marks. There's no aggression, no clear betrayal. There's only the wear and tear, the exhaustion of someone trying to love someone who only knows how to drain you. And the cruelest part is that sometimes the person who destroys you is exactly the one who says they love you. Rumi said, "What hurts you also blesses you. Darkness is your path to the light." But how can you find that light when you are trapped in a love that obscures you? How can you awaken to the blessing if you are surrounded by emotional manipulation, by bonds that imprison you, by relationships where your pain is invisible, but constant? Do you feel you need to be silent to keep the peace? That you can't show weakness because it will be used against you? That you need to agree so as not to be rejected? Then perhaps you are experiencing exactly that, the kind of presence that makes you believe that loving means disappearing, that being seen requires erasing yourself, that to have someone, you need to stop being yourself. But the soul doesn't lie. It gives signs, signs that appear as anxiety without cause, persistent tiredness, sadness that comes from nowhere. It's the body trying to say what the mouth is afraid to confess. And the heart, the heart. It asks for silence because it's trying to protect itself. It's saying, enough. Enough of loving alone. Enough of accepting little. Enough of justifying the unjustifiable. Enough of trying to fix what isn't broken in you but in the other person. But even knowing this, you continue, perhaps hoping that one day, everything will change, that the other person will realize, that love will win. But true love doesn't need to win an internal war. It doesn't demand constant sacrifice. It doesn't drain. It nourishes. It doesn't imprison. It liberates. And if you're in a relationship where you need to be silent to be loved, you're not being loved. You're being conditioned, molded, silenced. And when you become too silent, a part of you dies. Little by little, almost imperceptibly. First your inner voice, then your spontaneity, then your dreams, and finally your essence. That's why the silence of the heart is so dangerous when it's born from fear. Because it doesn't heal, it hides. It masks a pain that, the more it's repressed, the more it grows inside. So perhaps now is the time to ask yourself, why do I continue? Why do I accept so little? Why do I remain silent, even when everything inside me screams? Perhaps the answer lies in your history, in the old traumas that still govern your choices, in the fears you inherited, in the emotional void you tried to fill anywhere, even if it cost you your peace. But now, something within you is awakening, something that no longer accepts less than it deserves, something that is beginning to remember that your soul was made to fly, not to crawl for emotional crumbs. And even if this awakening comes with pain, it is sacred, because pain, when accepted, when listened to, when traversed, transforms into a key, into liberation. If this part spoke directly to your soul, write in the comments, "I will no longer remain silent in order to be accepted." Let this phrase be the beginning of your new start. Rumi reveals, don't linger in places where your soul doesn't flourish. But the question that often echoes, sometimes silently, is, why, even knowing this, do we persist? Why do we remain where the soul is silent, where energy fades, where laughter no longer arises spontaneously? Why do we choose environments where our truth needs to be hidden so that the other person can remain? Why do we return to arms that squeeze more than embrace? The answer, though painful, is simple and profound. Because we confuse intensity with love, pain with connection, silence with peace. And this is not just a rational error. This is emotional programming. It's a pattern that is born long ago, often in childhood, where we learn that affection comes with effort, that presence comes with fear, that being seen requires merit. And that's why, when we encounter confusing relationships, where there is warmth and coldness at the same time, something within us recognizes this chaos as home. This is where spirituality meets psychology. When you understand that you're not experiencing a difficult love, but an unconscious emotional attachment that imprisons you. And more than that, you're repeating cycles. You're trying to heal, in the present, wounds from the past. Wounds opened by people who didn't listen to you, who didn't validate you, who made you believe you needed to get hurt to be loved. And without realizing it, you start attracting situations where pain feels like home. That's why the heart gets confused, because there's a part of you that's become accustomed to absence, to insecurity, to instability, a part of you that believes intensity is proof of love, that if it doesn't hurt, it's not real, that if it's too calm, then it will end. But the soul knows, and it begins to send signals. It doesn't scream, it falls silent, it withdraws, and it is in this silence of the soul that the root of your pain resides. You don't suffer because you love too much. You suffer because you've forgotten yourself. You suffer because you've learned to measure your worth through the eyes of others, because you've disconnected from your essence trying to maintain connections with those who weren't willing to see you as a whole. You suffer because your heart is tired of beating for someone who never wanted to stay. And yet, you persist. And what's most cruel, you still blame yourself for feeling all this. But make no mistake, this is not weakness. This is an old wound begging to be healed. It's a neediness disguised as love. It's fear of abandonment disguised as romance. And until you face this honestly, with spiritual courage, you will continue to hurt yourself in relationships that remind you of what has already hurt you, and not of what can heal you. Rumi said, "You have to keep breaking its heart until it opens." And that is one of the hardest truths to accept, because pain, when ignored, repeats itself. But when faced with awareness, it transforms. It becomes a gateway, a beginning, a portal to rebirth. The spiritual root of pain lies where you least want to look. It's in the way you relate to others. It's in the words you don't say for fear of seeming weak. It's in the no's you swallow, in the boundaries you don't set, in the anxiety that appears every time you feel the other person is about to leave you. It's in the exhaustion that comes after yet another attempt to be enough. But none of that is who you are. That's what you've learned. That's emotional survival. But you didn't come into the world to survive. You came to awaken, to remember that you are whole, that you don't need to beg for crumbs, that you don't need to adapt to absences, that your presence is sacred and should be welcomed, not tolerated, and that any place where your soul doesn't flourish is not home. It's captivity. This is the moment when you need to stop and observe, not the other person but yourself. Observe the patterns, the repetitions, the choices you make when you're afraid, the way you sabotage yourself when you start to approach something that truly makes you feel good. Because sometimes it's easier to go back to what hurts than to receive what heals. Because what heals requires change, and change is scary, but his heart has already begun this process. He is more attentive, more selective. He no longer accepts what he used to accept. He no longer believes in empty promises. He no longer gives in to the first offer, because now he has learned to listen to the silence of the soul. And this silence is sacred. It is within it that wisdom is born, healing, the conscious choice to stop repeating the pain and begin to live the truth. You can continue looking for someone to blame, or you can start looking for meaning. You can continue justifying the mistakes of others, or you can start healing your own. You can continue trying to be loved, or you can start loving yourself. But one thing is certain. As long as you insist on remaining silent where your soul is, the pain will continue screaming inside. And healing won't come from the outside. It won't come from someone else changing. It won't come from a new story without a new you. Healing begins when you accept that your soul deserves to flourish, even if that means leaving where you always wanted to stay. If this part of the video touched something deep within you, write it in the comments. I choose to bloom, even if in silence. Let these words find you like seeds, and your soul will know what to do with them. No one tells you this, but it's essential that you hear it now. True love never forces you to silence who you are. It never demands that you dim your light to fit into someone else's emotional space. It never turns your essence into noise. And it never, ever, makes you need to hide inside yourself to be accepted. Because when someone's presence becomes dangerous, the heart screams, not with words, not with revolt, but with a profound silence that weighs more than any argument. A silence that doesn't welcome. It suffocates. This is where many souls get lost, trying to fit in where they aren't seen, trying to be loved by those who don't have the inner space to receive it, trying to be enough in scenarios that demand sacrifice, not presence. The spiritual key to healing begins when you understand that loving isn't about enduring. It isn't about silently bearing it. It isn't about building castles in the desert of the other person's emotional absence. Love is expansion. It's being who you are without fear. It's breathing deeply next to someone and feeling that your chest doesn't tighten. But that key isn't easy to find because it's hidden behind everything you've been wrongly taught about love. You were told that love requires effort, that those who love endure, that relationships are inherently difficult, and that if you're not happy, maybe it's your fault. Maybe you're not trying hard enough. Maybe you're demanding too much. Maybe you have unrealistic expectations. And so you mold yourself. You cut pieces of yourself to fit in. You erase your intuition in the name of a peace that never comes. But Rumi said, "You were born with wings. Why do you insist on crawling through life?" And that is the hidden spiritual key. You were born with a free soul, born for fullness, not for attachment, born to be whole, not half. True spirituality doesn't silence you. It awakens you. It reminds you of who you are before fear, before pain, before guilt. And that's why often the healing process begins with the courage to leave, not as an escape, but as a return to oneself, a return to the inner voice, a return to the sacred that exists in recognizing one's own worth. Nobody told you that suffering only persists when you refuse to go through it, that pain becomes a prison when you decide it's your identity, that the silence of the heart, when ignored, transforms into symptoms, into anxiety, insomnia, recurring sadness, apathy, because the body feels what the soul can no longer hide. And when you ignore the silent cry of the heart, it finds other ways to get your attention. The key is to stop looking outside for what has always been inside. It's in realizing that no love that demands you betray yourself is real, that no presence that disconnects you from your truth is divine, that no relationship that forces you to be small is spiritual. The soul knows this, and that's why it gets tired. Tired of pretending to be strong, tired of justifying what no longer has an excuse, tired of staying silent for fear of losing the other person, when in reality, what you are losing is yourself. This is the exact point at which many awaken, when they realize that continuing to insist is self-abandonment, when they understand that remaining silent is continuing to feed a cycle that will never change, when they look in the mirror and no longer recognize who they have become. And at that moment, a spark ignites, a space opens up, and that's where the healing begins. Rumi said, "What you seek is seeking you. You are searching for love, and true love is trying to reach you, but he cannot find you where your soul is not. Nothing can flourish where you remain silent. You can't touch your essence if it's hidden behind masks, roles, or silent pacts you made to avoid being alone. The spiritual key lies in the decision to no longer be silent, to no longer beg, to no longer diminish yourself, to trust that something greater awaits you on the path of truth, because everything changes when you stop asking for love and begin to give yourself love, when you stop waiting for others to listen to you and begin to listen to yourself, when you stop pretending everything is all right and honor the sacred chaos that pushes you towards transformation. Your heart asks for silence because it's trying to protect you, because it already understands that this place, this person, this dynamic is not home. And while you insist, it shrinks. But now you know. Now something inside you is awakening. Now you hold the key. And even if it still hurts, even if there are still doubts, even if fear still tries to convince you to stay, you are no longer the same. If this resonated with you, write it in the comments. I choose myself, even if in silence. Because sometimes, liberation begins with a whispered choice. But that whisper, within the right soul, echoes like thunder. Perhaps you are experiencing this right now. Perhaps it is precisely at this moment, as you listen to these words, that your heart is trying to warn you once again. You remain silent to keep someone by your side. You choose silence as a strategy, not as peace. You don't say what you feel so as not to push them away. You swallow the pain so as not to bother them. And you accept little, the bare minimum, as long as the other person stays. Before you smiled naturally. Today, You weigh every gesture. You measure every word. You review every message before sending it. And even so, you remain insecure. You remain afraid of being too much, or of being too little. You live on an emotional tightrope where any misstep could cost you the other person's affection, and this constant fear makes you live on the outside and die on the inside. This is how the soul begins to disappear. Not all at once, not loudly, but with small daily concessions. You accept the delay that used to hurt you. You forgive the recurring absence. You invent excuses for what deep down you already know has no justification. And you begin to build a reality where the other person is always right, and you are always guilty. You don't realize it immediately, but the process is slow and precise. First, you stop saying what you feel. Then you stop finding pleasure in things that used to make you feel good. And then, you start living according to the expectations of others. A validating look, an approving gesture, a reassuring response. You begin to exist in someone else's reflection. And that seems like love, but it's dependence. Perhaps you're exactly in that cycle right now, trying to hold on to a relationship that's already over inside, but that continues to live on out of stubbornness, attachment, fear of emptiness. Maybe you keep clinging to someone who no longer sees you. Maybe you're waiting for signs that never come, answers that never arrive, gestures that aren't repeated. And maybe, deep down, you already know, but you still can't say it out loud. This is the reality for many. People who aren't physically abused, who don't suffer explicit violence, but who experience continuous emotional erasure. People who gradually fall apart, who learn to be silent, to endure, to adapt to relationships where there is no room for true reciprocity. And the cruelest part is that this becomes a habit, a pattern, a silent way to disappear. You start avoiding conflict, avoiding conversations, avoiding even feeling, because any more intense emotion seems dangerous, and silence becomes protection, but it also becomes a prison, and that's where the spiritual key we talked about before needs to be used. Because even immersed in this scenario, there's an invisible thread that still connects you to your truth. Something in you still knows that this isn't love, that true love doesn't demand self-abandonment, that true love doesn't ask you to disappear. Let's imagine this story concretely. A woman, strong on the outside, but exhausted on the inside. At the beginning of the relationship, everything was bright. Beautiful words, intense gestures, constant presence. She opened up, trusted, surrendered, and when she realized it, it was too late. He began to distance himself, subtly, first emotionally, then physically. His silence began to speak louder than any past declaration, and she began to try to compensate. She blamed herself, demanded too much of herself, did everything to maintain what once was. She didn't realize it, but she was being drained. She distanced herself from her friends. She stopped doing what she loved. She changed the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she existed, all to try and salvage a connection that had already been broken. But with each attempt, she lost herself more, until one day, she woke up, and looking in the mirror, she no longer saw the woman she once was. She saw only a shadow, and in that instant, the silence screamed. It was in that inner cry that she understood. Staying there meant abandoning herself completely. And even with fear, even with pain, even with love still pulsing, she decided to leave. Not the other person, but everything that prevented her from returning to herself. This story could be yours, or it could be someone you know. But above all, it is a reflection of a universal truth. When you lose yourself to keep the other person, you disappear. And no presence is worth the price of your inner absence. The soul, when it awakens, can no longer pretend it doesn't know. And perhaps you are at that point now, between continuing to insist on what hurts, or beginning to rebuild yourself in what liberates. The choice will never be easy, but it will always be necessary, because remaining silent to keep someone is the slowest way to disappear. And you weren't created to disappear. You were created to expand, to feel, to flourish. If this video clip resonated with your story, write it in the comments. I recognize myself in my own presence. Because sometimes all your soul needs is for you to finally come back to it. Silence can be sacred, or a prison. It can be a refuge, or punishment. It can be a portal to the divine, or an abyss where your soul is lost. It all depends on where it comes from. If silence comes from your peace, it heals. But if it comes from fear, it corrodes. And that's where the turning point begins. When you understand that you are silent, not out of wisdom, but out of exhaustion. Not out of serenity, but out of emotional oppression. Many confuse the absence of conflict with harmony. But Rumi said, close the door gently, if that place is no longer yours. And this doesn't only apply to physical places. It also applies to the bonds you maintain out of habit, to the relationships you no longer have the courage to question, to the connections that have already broken, but that you insist on sustaining because of the memory of what once was. And every time you silence your heart to maintain something like that, it's as if you're saying to yourself, my peace doesn't matter, but it matters. Your peace matters. Your soul matters. Your light matters. And no matter how much you've learned to mold yourself to fit into someone else's world, there comes a time when your soul says, enough. A time when you feel, without understanding exactly why, that something needs to change. And that feeling, that inner discomfort, is life trying to reposition you. It's your spiritual consciousness expanding. It's the wisdom of your soul pushing you back to yourself. You've spent too much time erasing yourself, diminishing yourself, getting lost in roles that were never yours. And now, the time has come to remember that silence is not synonymous with peace when what is silenced is your essence, that there is no true love where you cannot be whole, that there is no authentic spirituality where you need to pretend to be okay to be accepted, and that inner freedom begins with a choice, to stop betraying yourself, to maintain any kind of connection. This turning point doesn't happen from the outside in. It doesn't depend on the other person. It doesn't require the apology that never came, nor the recognition you always hoped for. This turning point is internal, silent, profound. It's the moment when you, even with fear, decide to return to your center, to your worth, to your truth. It's when you stop trading your light for emotional crumbs, when you finally realize that staying in a place that makes you sick isn't loyalty, it's self-abandonment, and no one can do this for you. No one can awaken you for you. No one can heal the wounds you hide if you continue to protect them. There comes a time when you can no longer ignore the signs, the repeated pain, the constant emptiness, the weariness of pretending, the desire to disappear. All of these are silent cries from the soul, pleas for rescue, invitations to start over. But starting over requires courage, and courage, contrary to what they say, is not the absence of fear. It's action despite it. It's moving forward even while trembling. It's speaking even with a choked voice. It's deciding, even without having all the answers. Because the truth is, deep down, you already know. You already know that what you're experiencing isn't fair to your soul. You already know that it's hurting more than it should. You already know that the silence you inhabit isn't peace. It's a prison. And this is where spirituality comes in as a vital force. Because we're not just talking about human relationships. We're talking about your connection to something greater, to your own essence, to your soul's mission, to the purpose that brought you here. And no purpose flourishes in barren ground. You need space. You need air. You need light. You need true presence. Your own. Rumi said, don't settle for stories of how things happen to others. Awaken your own legend. And awakening your own legend requires abandoning the role of supporting character in someone else's life. It requires you to stop waiting to be chosen. It requires you to choose yourself, to look at yourself with affection, with truth, with compassion, to acknowledge your pain, but not make it your dwelling place. From that point on, everything changes, because you change. And when you change, the world responds. Relationships are reorganized. Connections are transformed. And what no longer belongs to you naturally moves away, not as a loss, but as liberation, not as punishment, but as healing. You no longer need to beg for presence. You no longer need to silence your pain to maintain a false harmony. You no longer need to hide behind strategic silences. Now you can be whole. Now you can choose the sacred. You can choose yourself. And that, in itself, is already the beginning of a new story. If these words touched a deep place within you, write in the comments, I will not settle for anything less than my truth. Let this phrase echo within your silence, because sometimes it is in that echo that your true voice is born. You don't need to fight for love where there's only survival. You didn't come this far to live emotional battles disguised as affection. What your soul yearns for isn't a battlefield, but a garden where it can flourish. What your heart desires isn't another cycle of pain and attachment, but a safe space where it can finally rest, beat in peace, be heard without needing to scream. For a long time you confused presence with salvation. You believed that if you could keep the other person close, something inside you would heal. You hoped that external stability would resolve the inner abyss, and in that waiting you negated yourself. You hid desires, you repressed truths, you distanced yourself from yourself. But now, something inside you is beginning to awaken, a soft whisper, a silent call, an invitation to spiritual freedom. Healing doesn't begin when the other person changes. Healing begins when you stop using the other person as an excuse not to listen to yourself. When you are silent, but not to please. When you are silent, to listen to yourself. Because within you lies an ancestral wisdom, a voice that has been muffled by years of self-neglect, fear, and insecurity. But that voice is still there, alive, waiting for the moment to be truly heard. Spiritual freedom isn't about cutting ties, it's about letting go of those who never truly saw you. It's not about impulsive breakups. It's about stopping building bridges for those who only build walls. It's not about becoming cold, distant, or bitter. It's about becoming whole, conscious, present. You no longer need to beg for connection where only control exists. You no longer need to justify the other person's absence. You no longer need to fight to be a priority in the life of someone who only sees you when it suits them. This invitation doesn't come with easy promises. It doesn't say it will be simple. It only says it will be true. And what is true is what liberates, even if it hurts, even if it deconstructs, even if it forces you to look inside with more sincerity than ever before. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to stop negotiating your peace? Are you ready to choose the silence that heals, and not the one that suffocates? Rumi said, "Within you there is a light that never goes out, and that light may have been stifled, ignored, underestimated, but it was never destroyed. It's there, waiting for you to make space, for you to remove the old furniture of past pains, for you to let in the fresh air of a life where you belong. Because spiritual freedom is this, inner belonging. It's when you understand that your home is not a person, nor a relationship, nor a setting. Your home is your soul, and everything that separates you from it is exile. Enough of surviving within your own body, enough of calling inattention freedom. Enough of accepting absent presence as if it were love. Freedom begins when you look at yourself with the same tenderness you have always offered to others. When you stop rejecting yourself for fear of being rejected. When you stop silencing yourself to keep the other person and start listening to yourself, even if it causes silence around you. Spirituality is not a distant concept. It is the daily practice of self-respect. It is the subtle gesture of closing your eyes and asking, "What is my soul trying to tell me?" and listening to the answer, even when it brings uncomfortable truths. The soul speaks, and when you are silent to listen to it, everything changes, because what seemed empty reveals itself as fertile space. What seemed like loneliness shows itself as reconnection, and what seemed like an end becomes a new beginning. You spent so much time trying to be chosen that you forgot to choose yourself. So much time trying to hold on to someone who never fully committed that you forgot the greatest presence you need is your own. And this is the invitation, not for a breakup, but for a return, inward, home, to the center of your being, where you don't need to prove anything, where you are, simply, you. If this passage spoke to your soul, write in the comments, "I return to myself, unafraid of the silence." Let this phrase be the starting point. Because all freedom begins with a choice, and all healing with a return. We've reached that point of silence that no longer hurts as it once did, but still pulsates. A silence that has ceased to be a burden and has begun to be space. Space to breathe, space to feel, space to exist without asking permission. You walked with me through all these words, traversed memories, hidden pains, pieces of stories you may never have told anyone, and yet, everything you heard seems to have come from your own heart. This happens because what wounds the soul of one resonates in the souls of many. And there are silent wounds that scream in unison within thousands of people, even if each one thinks they are alone. But you are not. You never were. What you feel now, this mixture of relief, pain, and recognition, is a sign that you have finally begun to truly listen to yourself. For a long time, you sought answers outside yourself. You tried to find meaning in the gestures of others, in their absences, in words that never came. You tried to justify what you felt with logic. You tried to follow advice that never reached your depth. You tried to fit into versions of yourself that didn't encompass your essence. But now something has changed, because you allowed yourself to look inward without running away. And that, in itself, is already an act of spiritual courage. The heart that once remained silent so as not to lose, now begins to speak firmly, not in screams, not in despair, but with a serenity that is startling, because it is new, it is different, it is true. You no longer need to accept less than you deserve. You no longer need to repeat old patterns in the name of a story that only hurts you. You no longer need to hide behind a love that never truly saw you. You can choose now, and this choice doesn't require everything to change at once. It only asks for an internal decision, a gesture, a word, a more conscious presence. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to know what comes next. You just need to be willing to leave the prison of imposed silence and enter the temple of sacred silence, the one that heals, that welcomes, that reorganizes. This journey doesn't end here, because every awakening soul carries a new beginning within its heart. And perhaps this beginning won't be noisy. Perhaps it won't come with promises, but it will come with truth, with direction, with purpose. You are no longer in the same place where this video began, because now you have awareness. And awareness is the first step towards any lasting transformation. Rumi said, "Don't turn away so quickly from the whisper of the soul. Sometimes that's where God speaks loudest." And what you heard today, perhaps that was exactly it. A calling, a reminder, a voice that is neither mine nor yours, but life itself trying to tell you, you are ready. Ready to let go of what no longer serves you. Ready to build something new. Ready to allow yourself to exist fully. Ready to stop begging for love and begin to bathe in self-love. Now is the moment when you decide whether to remain silent again or to continue listening, not to the world, not to external expectations, but to that which vibrates strongly within you. The soul does not lie. The heart does not deceive. And if it asks for silence, perhaps it is not to escape, but to reorganize everything that has been disordered for so long. And if you still feel fear, that's okay. Fear is part of the journey. But don't let it paralyze you. Don't let it stop you from walking towards what you already know you deserve. Freedom begins small, with a thought, a step, a phrase, a silent decision. But within that decision lies healing, lies reconstruction, lies a new story. You are no longer in the void. You are in the interval, between what hurt and what is yet to bloom, between what you endured and what you can now choose. And this space is sacred. Treat it like a garden. Water it with presence. Care for it with love. Protect it with truth. And above all, remain, not for anyone else, but for yourself. If this resonated with you, write in the comments, "I listen to my heart, even when it asks for silence." And let these words take root within you. Because your soul is ready to bloom. The soul knows. She just hopes you have the courage to listen. Rumi, if you've made it this far, it wasn't by chance. Some part of you needed those words. And now that they've found you, walk alongside this message. Subscribe to the channel, because this journey of silence, healing, and truth is only just beginning. And remember, if this video resonated with you to the very end, now is the time to leave a like, not for me, but for yourself, so that this message can spread and reach other souls like yours. And if you're still feeling that calling, that shiver, that silent certainty that you need to keep going, then do one more thing for yourself. Watch the next video that's on the screen. He is a continuation of that conversation. It is the next breath of your soul. Silence is no longer alone. Now he has a voice, his own.